Okay, with this podcast, I want to start talking about the international, or what we call the transnational dimensions of the Civil War. And this is the school of Civil War historians that I belong to, happily. And it's kind of interesting. If you'd taken my course, gosh, 5 years ago, even that recent, this part of the course wouldn't have even been included. This is something that's very new to the profession and very new to my thinking about the Civil War. And what got me going and thinking about the international dimensions of the Civil War, I started looking at the connections between the Confederacy and Mexico. And there was quite a bit of trade, for instance, between Texas and Mexico during the Civil War. I talked about the Union blockade of southern ports. Well, Texas was the only Confederate state that had an international border, of course, the Rio Grande. And the Union Navy couldn't blockade the Rio Grande because it goes into the interior. So tens of millions of dollars worth of cotton crossed over the Rio Grande into Mexico, and from Mexico was shipped out all over the world. And in return, goods from Europe were coming into Mexico, especially the Matamoros area, and coming up across the Rio Grande into the Confederacy. And so that's what kind of keyed me into thinking about the transnational dimensions of the war. And it's kind of a small world, the Civil War historians. And at a certain point, maybe 3 years ago, I got to know Don Doyle. The book that you're reading, I saw in an early manuscript form, and I actually got to comment on it and talk to him at length about it. And it's probably the most significant book written on the Civil War, I think, recently. And I think it's pretty readable as well. But I guess that's really up for you to decide. But believe me, there's books that are much less readable than Doyle's book. So what his argument is that the Civil War was it was a global event. It just wasn't a national event. So when I first started teaching the Civil War, I taught it like the war was in a box, and the box, the parameters of the box were the borders of the United States. Well, now it's very, very clear that the Civil War had a huge impact on other nations and outside the United States, and other nations outside the United States had a huge impact on what was going on during the Civil War. That there wasn't this artificial separation that, in fact, had really just been created by historians. And when you look at the Civil War internationally, his book really focuses more on Europe. What he's talking about is that the Civil War, from the point of view of conservatives in Europe, I'm talking about, remember, at this point, every European nation, with the possible exception of Switzerland, was dominated by a king or some kind of aristocracy. And how do you gain power under a kingship or aristocracy? It's who your family is, right? It's not about merit. It's not about upward mobility. It's about heredity. And this was the form of government that had really still dominated the world in the 1860s. I can't stress to you enough what a radical experiment the U.S. Republic was in the context of the 1860s. It's very hard in 2016 to see the United States as radical. But in the 1860s, the United States was the most successful democracy in the world, and more importantly, it was one of the very few democracies in the world. By the way, FYI, a little digression, almost all the world's democracies that existed in the 1860s existed in the Western Hemisphere. The rest of the democracies were Spanish-speaking republics, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and of course the Spanish-speaking republics had kicked out Spain. They'd had that colonial history. So let's go back to the U.S. So the U.S. is the most successful of all the world's democracies, but there's not that many democracies in the world. And from the point of view of the old world, and when I'm talking about the old world, I'm talking about Europe, and these monarchs and aristocrats that gain their power based on heredity, not based on merit. They're happy about the Civil War. They're very, very pleased. They always had assumed that the United States would not survive because this had been the traditional fate of democracies. That democratic rule was very unstable. This is what they saw as a big advantage to a monarchy. It was a very stable form of government. But the government of, by, and for the people that you have in a democracy was inherently unstable, that it led to things like civil wars. And that what often happened is that if a civil war didn't end a democracy, democracies usually ended up in dictatorships. So when Europe looks, old Europe, the ruling classes of Europe, Great Britain and France in particular, and that's who I'm going to focus on, that's who Doyle focuses on. When they look at the U.S., they're actually really pleased about what they see happening. They think finally, this ridiculous experiment that started in 1776, we knew this couldn't last. And we were right. Now, what had happened in Europe is Europe had just finished defeating a series of democratic revolutions in the late 1840s. There had been democratic revolts in France and in the German states, and they had been put down. And monarchy in the 1850s and 1860s, a monarchical form of government, aristocratic form of government, it seemed to be the winner on the world stage. It looked like monarchy had the wind at its back in the 1860s, and the democracy was going under. So this is really hard for folks in 2016 to kind of wrap their minds around, because we just assume, of course, that when it comes to the U.S. anyway, that democracy is going to win. Republican government is going to win. It's really the best form of government ever devised. But what I want to make clear to you is this: that in the 1860s, it looked like democratic government was about to take a fatal blow. And that fatal blow was the U.S. Civil War. That the U.S. in some sense had committed suicide. It had torn itself into the region of the South. They were unhappy about the results of a presidential election, and so they had just gone on their merry way. And so for folks that were believers in monarchy, believers in aristocracy, kind of government by heredity or power by heredity, they said, we always knew this would happen. We always knew that the United States would never survive, that democratic government is inherently unstable, and that our form of government is the way to go. And so where the U.S. and where the Civil War, where it fits into kind of global history in the 1860s, it fits into a global struggle of, on one hand, monarchy, kingship, aristocracy, that form of government, okay? And on the other hand, democracy, government of, by, and for the people, where power resides in the people, not in hereditary kings or in aristocrats. So what we understand as historians now is that the Civil War was part of a larger global struggle between democracy and autocracy. And it was a very important front in that global struggle. And there are other places where this is happening, especially in Europe. It's happening in Asia. It's happening in China as well. So the U.S. is just one theater of war one theater of conflict in a larger global struggle that in the 1860s pit the forces of autocracy, kingship, aristocracy, versus the forces of democracy, popular sovereignty, that the people choose their rulers. The rulers don't come from who their family is. And in a nutshell, that's how historians see the Civil War now. It was one front in a global struggle that pit, as I've said a couple of times, but I'm a big believer in repetition, democracy versus autocracy.